Cliff Neve will be giving our presentation on how to build a winning cybersecurity program. So Cliff.
Great, thank you very much, Jen. Hello, good morning. My name is Cliff Neve, and I'll be going through how to build a winning cybersecurity program and specifically tailoring it to financial institutions. Feel free to ask questions and I will address them at the end. And you can also contact me afterwards with any questions directly when I provide contact information at the end. So a little bit about myself. I'm an owner and chief operating officer with Mad Security. I've been doing IT and IT security for over 24 years. I concluded my 20 years as a Coast Guard officer as the chief of command at Coast Guard, or chief of staff at Coast Guard Cyber Command, where I worked with DHS, the FBI, the NSA, and a lot of other government agencies doing threat intelligence and also maritime cybersecurity support. I did some time at the White House as Deputy Chief Information Officer. I was also a Chief Enterprise Architect there. I've got some technical backgrounds educationally, some degrees and some cybersecurity certifications. Since joining Mad Security in 2013, I've especially enjoyed working with the financial institutions. I've worked with 2 of the largest banks in the US and more importantly, dozens of small and mid-size banks, consulting with FFIEC audits and other types of consultations for cybersecurity. For orientation, here are 7 steps to building a winning cybersecurity program. Having seen hundreds of organizations in multiple verticals, these steps I found are all applicable regardless of the size and type of organization. If I were to come into any organization as Chief Information Security Officer, this would be my roadmap. The first step in this roadmap is to gain executive buy-in and build a culture of cybersecurity awareness. How many of you have one person that is ultimately in charge of cybersecurity for your organization? Another question, how many of you have boards and/or executive leaders who champion cybersecurity? Every successful cybersecurity organization I've seen has top-down support. They have boards and steering committees that are active in cybersecurity. And you can almost pick out the ones where the boards and the executive leadership are active and where they're not. So the buck needs to stop with somebody such as a CISO or a CIO in the program. This executive buy-in will come into play later in the presentation when we talk about policy enforcement. It's extremely difficult to enforce policies and get buy-in if you don't have the backing of your board and executive levels. Here's a depiction of the Department of Treasury's Office of the Comptroller and Currency's 3 lines of defense. We have a 4th and 5th in there for completeness. So we'll start with the first line of defense here, which is basically the foot soldiers. Those are the folks who are on the ground, directly responsible for identifying risks. The second line of defense are the officers in your group, let's say. They're basically folks who aggregate your risks, take a bigger picture look, prioritize, and deal with some of the financial management and application of resources towards risk priorities. Then the third line of defense is the upper level that deals with regulations, establishes the risk appetite for your organization, and each organization has their own characteristics we'll talk about in a bit. So think of these folks as those who ensure that there's internal auditing done. We also have an understood 4th and 5th line of defense. The 4th line of defense here are external auditors that will come in, that you bring in usually to the organization to do blue teaming, to take a look from an outside perspective so you can baseline against other organizations and provide a little bit of a different view than what you can with your internal organic resources. And the 5th line of defense, those are your actual regulatory bodies that are conducting these audits. And what I like about this is that it shows that it isn't necessarily a top-down pushing of information, but more of a pulling of information from these 3 lines of defense up to the executive management and the board of directors. So hopefully you have this culture now, which supports cybersecurity. And then the next step is to get on with understanding what it is that you're defending within your information and information systems. Knowing what you're defending starts with an understanding of your business processes. FFIEC refers to these as your organizational characteristics. You may also hear them called missions or lines of business or other similar terms. But the reason that you invest in cybersecurity is to enable your mission and protect your assets. So you begin by documenting your critical business functions, conducting your business impact analyses, understanding how your information systems enable them, and the reliances that you have. So in the finance industry, of course, downtime generally can equate to lost revenue. So it's important to understand your service level agreements so that you can then have those requirements and ensure that your network is operating and protected to a level that supports those business functions. Frequently, cybersecurity is thought of more as a technological type enabler, but it needs to be thought of in context of being a business enabler. When I was in one particular organization, the chief information security officer took inventory and came up with 300 different systems. And what he did was he went through all those systems, all of the different reliances that those systems supported, and prioritized them and came up with a list from 1 to 300. And then that was how he was able to assign and allocate the finite resources that he had within the organization to make sure that the most important information systems were sustained and that the most important information was protected. So all of you are probably familiar with the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So a lot of times when we're talking about security, people tend to focus on the confidentiality and integrity perspective, but the A is incredibly important. And without your availability, of course, and meeting your SLAs, then that's a fail. Along with understanding your business and mission drivers, you also have to know what types of data, and especially what types of sensitive data, resides on your systems. So the FDIC Office of Inspector General has 6 different classifications that range from unclassified to classified. And then they have 4 different types of controlled unclassified info. So those are promulgated by the FDIC. But in addition to those, you're going to encounter other specific types of information that you have to account for. Typically, law enforcement agencies get involved with financial institutions. You all can get back to me. I've already heard a lot of stories from folks in the financial industry about law enforcement being involved with following the money in criminal investigations and how they have to segment some of that information off and some of the communications off with law enforcement officers. We also have a lot of mergers and acquisitions within finance, and you don't necessarily want your competitors or others to know about your acquisition sensitive information or your trade secrets. So all of these types of data have to be identified, classified, and access restricted to those who have the roles that need to know them. Very few organizations have a full understanding of exactly who does and doesn't have access to all of the sensitive data in their system. So this is an incredibly important part of that step. Along with your business and mission drivers and your data classification, you also need to know what your information systems look like and take an inventory of all the devices and applications and systems that you have within the scope of your boundaries. FFIEC breaks these out as delivery channels, technologies, and connections. So clearly you know that you've got servers and laptops, you've got mobile devices that might be BYOD devices where they're actually owned by your employees. And those create additional vulnerabilities that need to be accounted for through mobile device management and other means. But you have to fully understand what those types of devices do as they connect and what types of threat vectors that they open up to you. You may also have operational technologies, things like smart plugs and Internet of Things devices. And those you have to account for as well, as far as, are those segmented out from your normal networks, etc. Another foot stomp here is that in addition to those devices that you own on your network, there are frequently third-party connections. And it's tough enough to keep track of your own devices that are on your network, but if you have other folks connecting and they may have their own third-party connections, you can quickly get into fourth and fifth party connections to your environment. So it's really very important that you understand exactly what's in your environment and what you need to protect. So third-party connections are a huge deal, and every time that we do an assessment, we uncover surprises with people who have physical or logical access to equipment and data that folks are engaging in. We actually do an entire webinar on third-party connections. So you should think really long and hard about every third party that you allow access to your network. How many of you, a question for you to think about is how many of you have a managed service provider, somebody who has access to your network, somebody who gives you your laptops, somebody who has different connections for monitoring. And for those of you that do have managed service providers, what controls do you have in place, or what types of assessments are you conducting to make sure that if they're breached, you're not also compromised? So managed services is a big third-party connection to watch out for. Remote monitoring also creates holes in networks. If somebody's able to monitor something from home, then you have to make sure that the VPN or whatever other type of secure channel is actually secure and operating with the most up-to-date encryption algorithms. And then mergers and acquisitions is another issue. And a lot of times mergers and acquisitions happen so quickly that due diligence isn't done. So two quick examples of third-party connections or third-party issues gone very, very wrong. The first one is the so-called Marriott breach that happened last year that resulted in the compromise of over 383 million records, including over 5 million passport numbers and passport records. And everyone refers to it as the Marriott breach, but it wasn't actually Marriott systems that were breached. It was Starwood's reservation system that had been compromised 4 years before the acquisition happened. However, since Marriott acquired Starwood, they also acquired Starwood's problem. And so now you have Marriott with a black eye of the Marriott breach. In another incident in late 2013, Target had 70 million PII records compromised. And what happened there was a third-party HVAC contractor was phished. Their credentials were obtained, and the actors were able to log into Target's third-party website and exploit a vulnerability to the website and pivot and get access to 70 million pieces of PII information and also 40 million credit cards. And Target lost billions of dollars and they still haven't recovered. So every single third-party connection is an additional attack surface area added to your system. At this point, you should fully understand your attack surface and what you need to defend. But as Sun Tzu told us in The Art of War, if you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at those actors who you are defending from, those actors who are your enemies. Here's a good list of folks who will try to make for a bad day for you, enemies, if you will. These are entities or events that will endeavor to disrupt your CIA triad. Clearly, for financial institutions, organized crime is a significant threat actor in that vertical. You have individual and opportunistic criminals. We also have nation states that we see involved in many cases. And frequently in the past, nation states have targeted large banks. But what we found is that as large banks have become more and more secure, the amount of effort that nation states have devoted towards smaller banks and other verticals has started to pick up, because the bang for buck isn't there because the larger banks have gotten so good at cybersecurity. So I don't know if you all have had any interactions with nation states or gotten any visits from the FBI, but sometimes the FBI will inform commercial entities, hey, we have intel that you've been breached. So don't be surprised if you start to hear more and more nation state involvement within the finance sector. Here are the attack vectors that those enemies will use. And it's important to know what attack vectors that they use so you know how to defend against them. One of the big ones that's growing is web skimming. It's essentially where your websites and applications are compromised by third-party plugins that will steal data, much in the same way that people install the physical credit card skimmers at gas stations. So what happens is that these third-party plugins are installed nefariously on a website. Credentials are entered, and those credentials are then forwarded to an actor that sells them or makes use of them to log in and steal information or move money around themselves. Phishing continues to be a very favored avenue for attackers, and it's just as important to secure your human, as always, as it is to secure your systems, because your users can be a huge point of impact for threats. Another advancing or interesting attack vector is advanced persistent threats, and this is where the adversary comes in low and slow. A lot of these other ones are more of smash and grab activities, where an actor will come in and just quickly as possible take what they can. They know they're going to be detected at some point, and they grab what they can and then they leave. But this advanced persistent threat is more of when somebody comes in and tries to come in without being detected and then stay undetected within your systems, and over the long run gain strategic intelligence about what's going on in your network, and over the long haul steal more and more credentials. These are usually carried out by nation states, and there's a new APT, and these things are actually numbered. And APT 10 is a new advanced persistent threat that has come out, where managed service providers are targeted. And what these folks have figured out is that going after individual organizations is fine and dandy, but if you can get one MSP, then usually you can also compromise some or all of their customers, and you can then get dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of clients' information by using these MSPs as a launch point. And so that's been wreaking havoc. And how do you guard against that if you don't have a good feel for how your MSP does business or the controls that they have in place? So I mentioned MSPs. There's actually two different types of managed services that are offered within the IT community, and they're apples and oranges. The MSPs are your managed service providers, and they exist primarily to make sure that your data and your information and your systems are accessible to those people that need access to them. And they're primarily focused on administration. They probably provide your computers and your network support, and they may have some endpoint security, and they may even label themselves as an MSSP, but we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, about some of the distinctions. The MSSP, conversely, specifically exists to ensure that your information systems are not available to those people who should not have them. And they're focused on IT security specifically, and making sure that compliance is kept and maintained. As I mentioned, some financial institutions, particularly small ones, will have their MSP double as their MSSP. And while it may or may not save costs, you have a bit of a fox watching the hen house in many circumstances. And if you allow your MSP to also check the security box for compliance, you need to account for and understand the inherent risks for this approach. It may or may not fall within your organization's risk tolerance. So you've gotten your executive buy-in, you know what you're defending, you know who you're defending it from. Now it's time to take a good look at your risk management plan and establishing your risk appetite in how it meets your regulatory compliance and best practices. The foundation of your risk management plan consists of an understanding of what standards you're holding yourself to, as well as what standards you're being held to. And so if you take a look at these, I'd be interested in feedback later on from you about how many of you are familiar with these various frameworks, laws, and benchmarks. So one of the biggies here is in the upper right, and it's the Graham-Leach-Biley Act, and that was a law, which is a lot different from a framework or a standard. It's a law that's been in place since 1999 that requires financial institutions to explain their information sharing practices to their customers. It also accounts for probably more mail than just about any other law in history, as financial institutions are constantly sending out this information and sharing them with their constituents. So are any of you doing business with European Union citizens? That's something that I'd be interested in circling back with you all on and seeing how many of you are subject to GDPR, which is now mandated by the European Union. And if you're holding any information, whether for marketing purposes, their financial information, or even employees that are citizens of countries in the European Union, then you are susceptible, or you're responsible for meeting the tenets of GDPR, which is not only cybersecurity controls, but additional privacy controls well above and beyond what GLBA and some of the other US laws allow for, although probably we will start to see more GDPR-like regulation coming. And an example of something that GDPR requires that isn't necessarily required by US-based only institutions is the right to be forgotten. And so when someone is no longer a part of an organization, there has to be evidence shown that they are now basically forgotten, as though they never existed or their information had never existed in that organization. The FFIEC handbook is one that I've used a lot, and I think it's very good. I prefer using it to some of the other frameworks like ISO 27000 and NIST, because ISO and NIST tend to be more binary in nature. Either you do or don't meet a control. In the FFIEC, on the other hand, they actually grade you on 5 gradients, and 6 if you count that you're not even meeting the baseline. So it's basically, 1 through 5, but there's also a 0 if you're not meeting it. And here's an example of one of the controls in the FFIEC examination handbook. And this is for threat intelligence. And so when you take a look at this, you can see that, baseline has its very defined standard on through evolving, intermediate, advanced, innovative. And some of these, what you can do is build a profile where there's an appropriate level of threat intelligence that you need as part of the organizational characteristics of your institution. And so it may be that, you only need to be at intermediate, or you only need to be at evolving, based upon your risk appetite and other things. So this allows for a little bit more flexibility than you do or you don't. I very strongly recommend the use of a risk register, a repository where you can track the risks, and we'll talk about gap assessments here in a little bit. But if I were to sit down with 5 different stakeholders within your organization and ask them to list out their top 3 cybersecurity risks, would those 5 individuals come up with the same 3 risks, or would they come up with different risks? And usually the answer to that question can be found by either you do or you don't have a risk repository that everyone has access to and everyone briefs from, knows, and understands. These are the biggest risks, and these are the risks that need to be brought down with the most level of resources and effort to provide us the best risk stance. This particular one is just a quick sample that I'd done using ISO 27002 controls so that folks could understand their inherent risk rating qualitatively. But there's a ton of different options out there and templates out there. We're happy to provide examples for whatever framework you've got. If you want to reach back out to us, we're happy to provide some sample risk registers. But the bottom line is there has to be something where everybody's on the same page regarding cybersecurity risk so that funds are spent in the right place and efforts spent in the right place. So after gaining buy-in, knowing what I'm defending, who I'm defending it from, and building my risk management plan, I need to make sure that I have policies and plans that reflect my risk appetite and my organizational characteristics, and policies and plans specifically that are enforced. So here's a couple of examples of different plans that you might have in place. And in addition to having them written down on paper, it's also crucial that you exercise them and review them regularly. So how do you make sure that these policies are enforced? And it's something that we're interested in talking to you all about, and about some of the good experiences and negative experiences you might have with trying to enforce policies, because every culture is different. Just 2 days ago, I talked to a CIO at an agency that I work with, and she told me that basically no one read the policies and she couldn't get any teeth on folks adhering to them. So I asked her, okay, so who approves the policies? Who sees the policies? How are they promulgated? She told me that she basically, as the CIO, went ahead and approved and published the policies. And I asked her if it might make a difference if the board approved them. And she thought about it for a little bit, and she said, yeah, it'd be kind of painful because, getting things through the board and get them approved is painful. But if I was able to do that, then yeah, sure, there'd be teeth. So this idea of enforceability kind of harkens back to our step 1 of the 7-step process, which is that gaining executive buy-in. Your policies need to be applicable to your organization, not just generic templates that you buy online. One particularly egregious case that I saw, I was conducting an ISO 27000 audit, and a client simply copied and pasted all the 27,000 controls, not 27,000 controls, but the ISO 27,000 controls into a Word document. And they basically just added the word, our company does this control, our company does the next control. And clearly that's not okay. Clearly that's not in the spirit or helpful as far as what's going on. So what happened was we essentially stopped the audit and instead helped them to write their policies properly, and then did the audit actually later on. So now that you have your policies and your risk management frameworks and you know your environment, it's time to conduct your gap assessment. There's 3 main components to your gap assessment. The first is preparing and conducting your gap assessment. The other is to document the results. And the third is to develop and carry out your plans of actions and milestones and manage your risks. So the other critical piece of this is that I recommend that folks do this internally, but then also get a second set of eyes via annual assessments. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, about annual assessments. So again, going back to step 1 of gaining executive buy-in, when you start this gap assessment, you have to make sure that you have the support of the organization, because people are busy. Your HR rep, your physical security folks, your contracts folks, they're all busy on a day-to-day basis. So now you're going to be working with them on this gap assessment, and some of those controls they're on the hook for. So it's important to be organized and make best use of everybody's time. So if you have this key stakeholder collaboration in place, what I find is that usually you want a charter for this gap assessment to come from either the board or the IT steering committee or the audit committee, or somebody who has some type of authority. And as mentioned, this will involve more than just the technical folks within your organizations. Preparation is key, and gathering all the applicable policies prior to the engagement will make it go much quicker and easier. These are all examples of policies that you may or may not need or may not have. So in Mad Security audits, we take a look and we ask for all the policies, all the procedures, because that helps us in advance of technical testing, in advance of interviewing, it helps to give us the written version of what the organization thinks they need to look like from a risk appetite perspective, and the notional security posture. So we're able to then go into interviews and technical testing with an understanding of what the expectation is in advance, and we're able to read these policies, clarify them, and help them out. How many of these policies your organization has depends upon the size and the type of your organization, but this is a good list here. And in addition to those written plans and policies, you need to make sure that you have a record of past vulnerability and scan reports, the most recent ones, as well as your past pen test reports and PCI assessments. Your network diagrams, which I always find to be a challenge because folks don't engage in step 2, which is knowing what is on their network. And if you can't produce a good network diagram, then I'm not sure how you get past step 2. But we frequently find problems with folks being able to produce network diagrams. But having these artifacts in advance also help provide context so that we get the most out of our out of the audits. So now we've got our buy-in, we know our environment and who we need to defend it from. We have a good risk management program in place, and we've got plans and policies that are being enforced. We're doing an annual gap assessment with technical validation. That we're not done yet. We have to conduct that day-to-day continuous monitoring. A lot of those other actions are point-in-time issues. And in cybersecurity, the adversaries are operating in real time, not point in time. So it's important to have continuous monitoring, and either you have your own security operations center, which an overwhelming majority of small and mid-sized businesses cannot afford to do because the level of talent and the number of people and the cost of the technology is truly cost prohibitive. So what I'm going to do instead is focus on what a good managed security services provider will offer. And if you have a managed service provider only, also doubling as your MSSP, I very strongly recommend that you make sure that they have these 6 elements that they're doing as part of it, or they're probably not really meeting your risk expectations. So in the upper right, we start with asset discovery. It goes back to step 2 of knowing what's on your network. When we're going through our onboarding processes and we do this automated asset discovery, there are always shocking revelations that come up as we say, hey, did you realize that this is on your network? Hey, we're seeing this on your network. Did you know it was there? And so asset discovery is one of the most important and fundamental elements of a managed security services offering, because knowing what's on your network and being able to detect rogue devices that will provide holes in your network is a critical tenet of that. The next element are vulnerability assessments. So your MSSP should be conducting passive and active vulnerability monitoring, and this is usually signature based, and it's kind of continuous compliance, looking for issues that are known and are part of the signature database of these vulnerability scanners. The next element up is threat detection, and this is being able to see folks that are trying to intrude into your network or in your hosts, whether these are endpoints or people trying to access through your firewalls. It includes integrity monitoring of files and other considerations. The next step is a synthesis of those other steps. So those 3 are usually signature-based or host-based. A good MSSP will provide behavioral monitoring, and that's your real-time monitoring and knowing what your network normally looks like and identifying anomalies that are occurring within your network that are out of the norm, that are out of spec. And so this is a critical part for identifying advanced persistent threats, which may use sophisticated methods that bypass anything that a signature-based vulnerability assessment might find, or that your normal NIDS and HIDS would find, and they're more low and slow. So behavioral monitoring is where those APTs, if they're going to get picked up get picked up. Behavioral monitoring will also take a look at and identify your problem users, your problem devices, so that you can figure out, hey, what's going on with these users and these devices, and why are they continuing the pop? And that can lead to some interesting findings. The next element is human security behavior. We talked about phishing as a vector and how that is not going away. If anything, it's getting more targeted and more sophisticated. And with phishing, that includes not only malware installation, but also extortion. And a lot of ransomware is done through phishing. So we as an MSSP, Mad Security, provides simulated phishing attacks as part of what we do. And talking to some of the folks last week that I talked to at some community banks, they were engaging parties for conducting phishing, simulated phishing attacks as well. That can be even more valuable when done in conjunction with your MSSP, who has the full version of your network, who understands what your threat appetite is and what your likely attack vectors are. The final element is security intelligence, and this is kind of where the one of the bigger pictures of MSSP is. The security incident event manager is the brain of your managed security services offering. And what it does is a SIM takes feed from all your different logs, including your routers, your firewalls, all those devices. It ingests them, and it can correlate and find out where thresholds for your overall network are being exceeded, even if just one firewall's thresholds are not. So it allows you to tune those. Now, one foot stomp here is that some organizations try to run their own SIM. We've been working with SIMs for over a decade, and the level of talent needed to truly tune a SIM properly is very, very high. And being able to get and retain those strong SIM engineers internally, as opposed to using a managed security service provider, is extremely difficult. So, so at any rate, a SIM is a very important piece of that, along with your log management and your threat intelligence. Somebody on a webinar earlier this week asked me about what I thought the biggest advances or technologies that were coming in cybersecurity, and my answer was quicker response to threat intelligence, better threat intelligence, and using AI to better understand what's coming so that you can quickly implement your defenses. As it is right now, it's a game of offense, defense, and basically the defense is responding to the offensive's capabilities. And as the offense picks up their game, because they are, their ability to modify and deploy exploits quickly they're becoming quicker and quicker in their cycles. So from a defensive perspective, it becomes more critical for us to be able to respond quickly. We can't just wait for Patch Tuesday to roll around. We have to operate in real time. So to recap, these are the 7 steps to build a winning cybersecurity program, starting with your culture and then working on through to continuous monitoring. A little bit about Mad Security. So we've been around since 2010. We're strictly a cybersecurity company. Many of us have decades of experience. We don't do managed service providing. We don't do help desk. We only do security. We want to be the very best at what we do. We don't want to try to be pretty good at everything. We can help you with all 7 steps that I've addressed, from CISO consulting to policy drafting and review, gap assessments, technical testing, ranging from vulnerability assessments and pen testing to really sophisticated red teaming and social engineering. But the centerpiece of Mad Security's cybersecurity capability is our managed security services. And that's what we focus most of our efforts on, and we're extremely proud of the service that we provide and the level of partnership that we have with our clients. In addition to focusing solely on cybersecurity, we also specialize in your exact demographic. and that's small to mid-sized financial institutions. And by specializing in that field, in that vertical, we ensure that we know how to talk the talk. We understand all your regulations. We understand the FFIEC handbook and GLBA and all of your different compliance and regulatory needs, including PCI compliance, etc. So we would love to talk to you about your current setup and see if we can provide some insights. So please feel free to give us a shout anytime. Thank you very much for attending today. Again, please feel free to reach out to me or to any of these contacts, and we'd be happy to help you.
Thank you very much, Cliff. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to click on the messaging button icon on the top right of your screen if you have anything you'd like to ask Cliff directly. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We will be sending out a live recording of this video in about 24 hours to 36 hours. So, please look forward to that email in the future, and feel free to join us on another webinar later this month. Thank you guys so much.